Thank you for the introduction, Brian. And I did not put social cohesion in the title because I dare not, in the presence of one of the world's leading scholars on social cohesion, Andrew Marcus, who's sitting over there, and who you'll be hearing from later in the day. On September the 11th in Chicago, almost to the hour, 108 years before the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 1893. And it was during the height of the 1893 World Depression. The Parliament of the World's Religions held its first session. And this was really at the end of the colonial era of globalization, which had been triggered by technological innovations such as the steam engine and the telegraph. And the 1893 Parliament fitted into that particular pattern. And it really was the first truly global interfaith event where religious leaders from East and West met in formal dialogue. It was very diverse for its time, but it could have been and should have been more diverse. Indigenous Americans didn't get invited, and immigrant Americans didn't play much of a role. The Turkish Sultan turned down the invitation, and there were very few Muslims there. In those days, the Asians were called Orientals, and the Muslims were called Mohammedans. And the world was divided between Christians and heathens, Christians and pagans. But it really was a very important event. And the stellar performer during the first Parliament of the World Religions, remembering that the second Parliament would take 100 years before it took place again in Chicago in 1993, was of course Swami Vivekananda, who is the spiritual father of modern India, Gandhi the political father. And the Chicago press at the time dubbed Swami Vivekananda the cyclonic monk from Asia, from India. And he really threw down the gauntlet to Christian supremacism with the words that sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant fanaticism have long possessed this peaceful earth. I fervently hope that the bell that tolled this morning in honour of this convention may be the death knell of all fanaticism, of all persecutions with the sword or with the pen, and of all uncharitable feelings between persons wending their way to the same goal. Unlike some others, the Swami did not argue for one world religions. As he said, this is an impossible hope. But he suggested that the Chicago Parliament had proved to the world that holiness, purity, and charity are not the exclusive possessions of any church in the world. Today, we live in a world of greater risk, limited controllability, and uncertain predictability, exemplified in recent months by the fate of the 2 Malaysian Airlines planes. And unfortunately, 2014 has been a vintage year for religiously inspired violence. The Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman has spoken about the precariousness of social cohesion in most nations across the world, the frailty of human bonds, and the disposability of persons, in contrast to our learning for togetherness. And he argues that even though we are connected, we are not necessarily united, because you can always press the delete button. Now, the psychologists tell us that religion is about the 5 B's of believing, behaving, belonging, bonding, and bridging. And as we heard yesterday, authentic religion is primarily concerned with the other of the transcendent, the other of the family, the other of neighbour, the other of enemy, and the other of creation. And unfortunately, there are many lazy minds, and this was touched upon yesterday, that accuses religion as being the cause of violence. May I suggest to you that you read Karen Armstrong's recent book, just published, called Fields of Blood, Religions and the History of Violence, where she argues, using the image of the scapegoat, argues that religion has often acted as a mask for violence over power and wealth, and has usually acted as a mitigating factor to humanity's inhumanity to itself. In terms of the social dividend, as we heard yesterday, religion at its best, despite its faults and many failures, adds to a nation's social capital and social cohesion, particularly through its teachings and public statements. And what we really need is, as nation states become increasingly pluralized, multi-faith spiritualities of individual holiness and social cohesion. And then religion also adds to social capital through all its different agencies. It has been said that you can take religion out of the state, but you can't take religion out of the nation. And a few years ago, Professor Gary Baumer and myself did a project for the Australian Human Rights Commission on freedom of religion and belief in 21st century Australia. And one of the striking things about what we found as we talked to religious leaders around Australia is the lack of understanding that religious leaders have of the role of the state in the governance and management of religion. And I prefer to talk about that the role of the state is to have the attitude of a positive neutrality, and that its three basic functions are to facilitating the observance of religious freedom, and facilitating the observance through allowing the building of churches and mosques and gurdwaras and so on. And that its second function is to bridge or broker the relationship between the various religious communities, especially at the national level, but also at the international level for those nations who pride themselves on being good international citizens. And the third function is to monitor religious activity for any religiously inspired fanaticism and violence which would represent a threat to the nation and its people. And of course, in that project, religious leaders have a special responsibility for social cohesion and interreligious harmony. And I think one of the other things that came out of our report is that religious leaders in particular need to be well educated and trained in how to exercise quality leadership in culturally, linguistically, and religiously diverse societies. Today, interfaith dialogue has become much more necessary. And I find very useful 10 principles which have been enunciated by Kenneth Fernando, who operates within the Anglican Communion and is a member of the network of Interfaith Conference within the Anglican Communion. And he talks about the first principle that we confess our failures and lack of love and sensibility to people of other faiths in the past. We intend to forgive one another, seek the forgiveness of others, and commit ourselves to a new beginning. The second, we affirm that good interfaith relations can open the way to a better relationship and peace throughout the world. We recognise building true community, both among persons and the various ethnic and religious communities, as our primary objective. We need to develop a global theology that will be appropriate for the unfolding sense of a globalised world. Number 4, we affirm the importance of promoting a culture of dialogue within and among all religious communities and Indigenous traditions. Next, we condemn violence and terrorism as being against the spirit of all true religion, and we pledge ourselves to removing their causes. Number 6, we shall respect the integrity of all religions and ensure that they have the freedom to follow their own beliefs and traditions. Number 7, we believe that the different religions are enriched by identifying agendas in which they can collaborate, such as making peace, protecting the environment, eradicating poverty, and ensuring the human dignity of all. Number 8, we affirm it is important for us all to listen to and to learn from other religions so that we can all value religious plurality as a factor that enriches our communities. We endeavour to live out and explain the truths of our own religion in a manner that is intelligible and friendly to people of other faiths. And lastly, cultural diversity as well as religious diversity in our communities will be affirmed as a source of enrichment and challenge. Now, I think it's been neatly summed up in the phrase that in the contemporary world today, to be religious must mean to be interreligious. And so the importance of leadership at the local level, because to be global is to be local. I want to now focus on 2 case studies. The first is the work of the Victoria Police Multi-Faith Council in Australia, and secondly, the work of the Asian Conference of Religions for Peace, both of which bodies I am associated with. The Victoria Police down in Melbourne was formed back in 2005. And of course, social cohesion very much relates to the quality of policing in a society. There's the old English axiom, the public are the police and the police are the public. They are the keepers of the local peace, and they are the key players in creating a local and national culture of peace. And so their role is absolutely critical. And there are many models of policing, militarist policing, zero-style policing. But this fits into the category of community policing, where it involves law enforcement agencies working with cultural and religious groups and other vulnerable groups. The Victoria Police has the phrase priority communities, to build trust with the police and with other such groups in addressing public safety issues such as physical attacks on minorities, terrorist attacks, arson of religious buildings, and so on. And the other key strategy is actually educating the police themselves about their obligations and responsibilities, especially in dealing with minorities, in accordance with the human rights provisions of a nation's laws and the international covenants. The model in Victoria is the formation of this council, together with the appointment of multicultural and multi-faith liaison police officers who are appointed to each police region. In Australia, the police, framework is there's a police force for each of the 6 states, and then there's also a national federal police. In Melbourne, the senior and local police attend iftar dinners during Ramadan. In fact, the police actually host one of the iftar dinners, and on Jewish special occasions, and they attend Buddhist and Hindu dinners on special religious occasions. The work of the council is developed around 4 aims. And so the first one is to work with, this is for the Victoria Police Multi-Faith Council, to work with the police in 4 areas. Firstly, in enhancing the effectiveness of their service delivery, police service delivery. So this is helping police work across religious and ethnic boundaries. Now, of course, the history of police forces in Australia is back in the early 80s, they were very, very, very Anglo. And there's been a gradual change over the last 30 years from that. And so the police needed help to work across these boundaries, to give assistance in managing emergencies such as bushfires and so on, and to identify priority areas and improve police information about ethnic and the recently arrived ethno-religious communities. To also assist the religious communities adopt the new technologies, especially when the new technologies have to be adapted to be able to use languages other than English. And then also to help in information and intelligence initiatives. The second aim focuses on improving community safety. And so here the objectives are to help the police through the religious education of ethical behaviour of their own communities in combating the drivers of crime, such as drugs, poverty, alcohol, organised crime and so on, in combating serious organised crime, volume crime, and also the role in educating their own communities about road safety and personal security. To assist in the underreporting of key crimes and antisocial behaviour, and a key initiative was in the area of domestic violence, which was grossly underreported, particularly in the ethnic communities. And so that situation has been much improved. And for the council and its constituent churches and Muslim and Hindu and Sikh and so on organisations to help in the rehabilitation of offenders and repeat victims, to address the causes of road trauma, as I've already mentioned, and to assist police in increasing their intelligence capability, particularly with regard to violence and also the impact of overseas events. The third aim is that the council is a stakeholder to work with Victoria Police in reaching out to religious and ethnic communities. And so this is really because many of the ethnic and ethno-religious communities come from countries where the police forces exercise different styles of policing, and are certainly not trusted by the people. The whole idea is to try and build up the trust of these communities in the operations of the Victoria Police Force, and also to help that through the religious media as a channel of communication with the different communities. Then also to support the recruiting of Victoria Police. About 4 or 5 years ago, we had our first Muslim female police officer, and so the hijab had to be modified to fit in with the police uniform. And we're now working with the police, because the police are not supposed to have tattoos, but among Pacific Islanders, that has a cultural meaning, and so there's some delicate negotiations going on about that. And then lastly, to assist in improving the knowledge, attitudes and skills of Victoria Police members. And so members of the council are involved in the pre-service training of Victoria Police, and then afterwards during their in-service about religious and cultural norms and so on. And also we have a whole lot of about 60 police chaplains to help them in their work, and then assist police in proactive policies in inculcating ethical police behaviour. Now, I think this is an example of practical dialogue working for the social wealth of a nation, of a state in this particular case. And it's played a key role on 3 occasions in Melbourne. One, when a group of religious extremists were planning to bomb Melbourne's largest stadium during the football grand final. The second time was when another group had plans to attack an army barracks outside Sydney. And then just recently, when the terror alert has been heightened, in particular when a young Afghani religious zealot from a well-regarded family background was killed when he attempted to stab 2 police officers several days after learning his passport had been cancelled because of his radicalisation. And at that time, a few weeks ago, we published an open letter, a full-page advert in the 2 local newspapers in Melbourne calling for calm and vigilance, and that was very much appreciated. And the police were extremely happy with the feedback. And there's a whole lot of other strategies. So that's my first case study. The second one is the Asian Conference of Religions for Peace. Religions for Peace International is the world's largest interfaith organisation with its headquarters in New York, founded in 1970, has 94 national chapters, and then it has these regional bodies, and the oldest and by far the biggest is the Asian Conference of Religions for Peace, which for the last 10 years has been headquarters in Seoul, but it's now been transferred to Tokyo. It has 20 members, and you can see them there, including the 2 Koreas, and I'll come back to that point. We've just recently admitted Myanmar and Malaysia. So this is an example of interfaith dialogue and cooperation at the regional level. And of course, with these 20 members, including China and India, we represent more than half of humanity. And we've just recently, I represent Australia on the body, we had the 8th ACRP Assembly in Incheon just in late August. It really is a gathering of national chapters, and I'll just give 2 examples here. One from Japan, and this was in their report just recently of their activity in Japan, which is quite a strong chapter. their network building through participation in world and regional assemblies. The World Assembly was held late last year in Vienna. Facilitating dialogue between religious leaders and scholars of China, Japan and South Korea, where obviously there are a lot of tensions. One thing I forgot to put up there, they've been building a better understanding on Islam with Muslim leaders and have produced a booklet in Japanese on the Muslim community and their beliefs. Advocating for reduction of armaments and nuclear weapons and issues relating to nuclear power generation, the environment and poverty. Conducting research into peace education. This has always been a big thing of the Japanese. And lastly, humanitarian programs after the tsunami following the earthquake and then other disasters around the world. The Australian chapter, among its work over the last 14-15 years, we ran the major interfaith events for the centenary of Federation back in 2001, and then there was a huge service, 10,000 people, a week after 9/11 in the big tennis stadium in Melbourne. And then we were the key organisation. We organised the Parliament of the World's Religions in Melbourne in December 2009, in which we had 6,500 participants. And now we're planning the Anzac Interfaith service, all being well, if we can raise about $150,000. This is for the Anzac involvement of Australian soldiers at Gallipoli in Turkey during the First World War, which is a central event in Australian history. They have an interfaith service next September the 20th, World Peace Day. Hopefully it will be telecast across Australia, starting off with a service and then a candlelight procession down to the Shrine of Remembrance. We sponsor the teaching of non-Christian religions into our government schools. This is a small program, about half an hour a week, of the Baha'i, Buddhist, the Greek Orthodox, who didn't want to go with the Catholics or the Protestants, so they came with us, the Sikhs and the Hindus. Then we have the Interfaith Week addresses early in February. And at the moment we're researching the multi-faith chaplaincy, where there are some issues, particularly in school chaplains, in government schools, and then the facilitation of local interfaith networks. There's about 40 across Victoria and into New South Wales as well. And something I haven't put there is our website, which is extremely up to date. If you just Google Religions for Peace Australia, you'll get to it. And our webmaster sits there in Shepparton down in Victoria. And this speech is already on the website. Now, during the Incheon Asian Assembly, it's held every 5 years, and there's always a declaration. And I just want to have this quote because it kind of illustrates the confidence of the Asian nations when they look at the world and they see Asia in the broad sense as the birthplace of the world's major religious traditions, that Asia has a special place in building a response around binding authentic values, irrevocable standards of virtuous behaviour, and deeply seated inner attitudes, all grounded in the unity of humanity. Spirituality abounds in Asia. And it goes on, and it kind of reflects that when they look at the world, that they would see Europe in decline, in serious decline, USA slightly less so, As a gift of the divine, spirituality is a transcendent force, making Asia one in its diversity, in its many expressions. It is an uplifting force of higher quality within the depths of the human person. It was interesting that the declaration specifically mentioned the danger of hate speech. And as someone who was involved in formulating the declaration, it came from quite a few different nations, the danger of hate speech, not only against other social and religious groups in a particular society, but also against other nations, especially in East Asia. And that this has significantly increased in the last 5-10 years as a result of the tensions in the East Asia area and the argument about the islands and all that. The Incheon Declaration cited the Global Peace Index, which is an index that's been put together by the Institute for Economics and Peace earlier this year, which is sponsored by the low-key Australian philanthropist Steve Killerley, who's very committed to the interfaith area, in fact is the treasurer of Religions for Peace International. The most peaceful countries are Iceland, Denmark, Austria and New Zealand. The least are Syria, Afghanistan and South Sudan. No surprise in that. But the analysis of the data, it's a survey of 162 countries encompassing 99.6% of the world's population. It's based on 22 indicators such as open conflict, terrorist activity, violent crime, relations with neighbouring countries. And without going into all the details, it's in the paper, but through a statistical analysis, it's come up with the so-called 8 pillars of peace. And so these were included in the declaration, and it urged religious leaders to support their governments to develop appropriate policies and practical programs around the 8 pillars. And it singled out particularly at-risk groups, including women and children, as well as migrants, refugees, and stateless people. At the moment, the United Nations, during the month of October and early of this month, has focused very much on stateless people, whose numbers are growing. And it also talked about the evils of child labour, child trafficking, child marriage, and drug trafficking. Another aspect of the declaration was the focus on megacities, which are cities with more than 10 million people. And of the 21 across the world, 10 are in Asia. And it recommended that, and there's a specific recommendation, recommending that there be research and environmental programs sponsored by religious groups and driven by religious communities. Now, when you have such a large organisation, and of course one of the perennial issues in interfaith work is money, and it's very difficult to get. And while I was listening yesterday to all the business, I just wish that business would give more money to interfaith dialogue and activities. When we were organising the Parliament of the World's Religions in Melbourne, we got almost no help from business corporations. There was some, but not that much. I mean, the Australian government and the Victorian government gave $2 million each because politicians implicitly understand social cohesion and the importance of multicultural and interfaith dialogue and activity and so on. In Australia, multiculturalism has been a policy for a long time, and its definition is built around the two principles of commitment to Australia and equality of opportunity for all, including immigrants and refugees who arrive at Brisbane Airport today. And then it has three dimensions: the maintenance and development of cultural and linguistic and religious heritages, access and equity for all, universal health system, and opportunity universal for all in the for children and young people. So that's been very important. Anyway, that's by the way. But getting money is a real problem, and it's certainly one of the difficulties ACRP has. I've just enumerated here what I see as the achievements of ACRP. And the first one I've put there was the participation in the post-9/11 assembly, a special extraordinary World Assembly that was held in New York immediately after, it was about a month later, after 9/11, when the leaders of Religions for Peace International, all the national chapters were called to New York to be briefed and really to show solidarity with moderate Muslim leaders and compassion for the victims. And it concluded with an interfaith ceremony in a church right beside Ground Zero that had not been damaged. Secondly, behind the scenes negotiations between the two Koreas, this has been a fascinating aspect, really, of the work that the two Koreas, when the North Koreans turn up, they don't always turn up, but when they do, the two sides then, after the executive meeting, go into 1 or 2 day session, and that's had some results, some. Can't exaggerate them because it is difficult dealing with North Korea. Special aid project in Sri Lanka during the Civil War. The annual accounting of each national chapter, and I gave two examples, Japan and Australia. The leadership participated in the negotiations in the whole Mindanao conflict, and one thing that came out of that was an interfaith centre that was established at the University of San Tomas in Manila. Support for Japan in holding the World Assembly back in 2006. The participation of China. This has been a really, really difficult issue because China has 3 bees in their bonnets: the Dalai Lama, Taiwan, and the Falun Gong. And so we felt that it was better to have China at the table. And so we've had to make concessions on those issues, and they do get very sensitive, as I found out just recently when I had Taiwan on a table that I had produced for a paper. So that the participation in the Parliament of World Religions in Melbourne, the entry of Myanmar and Malaysia, and the participation of ACRP leaders in important national initiatives. For example, starting on Thursday in Jakarta, there will be a World Peace Forum organised by Muhammadiyah and bringing people from Nigeria, Central Africa, and other hotspots around the world to talk about conflict resolution. And so some of the ACRP leaders will be there for that. So that's just an example. I think it's an example of practical dialogue, but it's also informational and relation-building dialogue across Asia. So those are just 2 case studies. I hope that you find that what I've said interesting as an example of interfaith activity and the positive things that can come out of it. Thank you.